Hello everyone, and thank you for turning out in such numbers to hear Caroline. You'll probably all be familiar with her and her expertise in this part of the world. A tiny bit of background, she's been a Master of Wine since 1992. And from 1995, she's been an independent consultant and writer. Before that, she was buyer for Augustus Barnett and Bass Group, and studied botany and plant sciences at university. She has been following the wines from this part of the world for 30 years, close to. She's the Hungary panel chair in the Cantor Wine Awards, so we've got a real expert here. And also, sadly, our trip, the circle trip to Bulgaria, had to be postponed earlier this year. And we owe a huge thanks to Caroline for being so instrumental and invaluable in setting that up. And we hope it will happen once life gets back to normal. But over to you, Caroline.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Right, let's get the right screen up. Hopefully you can all see this. I mean, I'm quite happy to take questions as we go along, if I can work out how to have my chat screen up as well. I'm not sure I can. So hopefully one of the moderators can keep me up to date then with chat questions as we go along. But anyway, yes, so 3 countries that I failed to change the heading, sorry. This is a look at the modern wines of Bulgaria, okay. And it's a country I've been following for a very long time, been very close to. I kind of feel that I grew up in wine alongside Bulgaria. And this is kind of when I first went there. So, I started my career, having left science and decided that life behind the microscope wasn't for me, and that I really fancied the idea of a career in wine. I was lucky enough to get a job as a trainee wine buyer. And of course, as junior member of the team, I got the not very glamorous Eastern Europe as my first buying responsibility. And at that time, it was massive business in the UK. But say, not very glamorous. So I got to cut my teeth on this part of the world. And so my first trip, it was actually my second trip abroad for the company, but my first sort of trip in my own right, I suppose, was an MW student trip to Bulgaria. And this is the kind of scene that was, this is a photo from that trip. And that kind of, I like it because it shows you why Bulgaria was so significant, because it was a time where, Western Europe couldn't really deliver these single varietal wines produced on a large scale, produced consistently. And, everybody says it was cheap, cheerful gut rot, but it wasn't gut rot. That's why we drank a lot of it, because yes, it was cheap and cheerful, but it was decent, reliable and consistent. And there were various relationships with people like Professor Amarin and winemakers that came over from the States to develop brands for the US market and so on. And then, of course, in the UK, people like, Sainsbury's Bulgarian Cabernet Sauvignon at one time was allegedly the single best-selling wine in the UK. Because Bulgaria did these varietally labelled wines consistently, long before Australia came in on the act. And, this scale of vineyard production was part of the reason why they could do that. And then this was also from, a winery back then on that first visit. You can see, and Julia and anybody from Eastern Europe will recognize these scenes. These were big tanks. Yes, there was stainless steel, sort of stainless steel. There wasn't temperature control, but they managed it by running cold water over the tank. So, there was some pragmatic steps, but, big volumes. And volume was what it was all about. And I say that, we kind of grew up in wine together. I started in the wine trade in 1988. The Iron Curtain started to come down in 1989. So it was the end of the old era and the beginning of the new era in Eastern Europe, where, the end of collectivized state control and volume production above all else came in. And in due course, and it took a long time in Bulgaria, the industry grew up and reinvented itself and is now an industry of 282 registered wineries at my last count. And again, close connection with Bulgaria. When I passed the MW exam in 1992, there were 3 Bulgarian wines on the red wine paper, which you can't imagine happening now. But that was indicative of quite how important Bulgaria was in the UK. It was the 4th biggest supplier of red wine to the UK. It was really significant. So as an MW student, we were expected to know about it. As it happened, I got the wines wrong, but I was wrong for the right reasons. I put them in Spain, but climatically, winemaking styles, American oak, that sort of thing. So I obviously got away with it. Always worth reminding people, I think, to put into perspective where Bulgaria is. So it's in the southeast corner of Europe. We have the Black Sea on the eastern border, which moderates the climate on the eastern side of the country. The western side of the country is more continental, but we're still sort of coming up from Greece into Bulgaria. There's still some Mediterranean influence, especially in the southwest corner of the country. And then obviously the north is cooler and more continental as you go towards Serbia and Romania. So it's a relatively small country. It's under 9 million people now. And then looking in a little bit more detail about how the wine regions are divided up. So Black Sea to the east, as I say. Now, when Bulgaria joined the European Union, it aligned all its wine laws with European Union standards. And at that time, it divided the country up into 2 PGIs. So the whole of the north of the country, this green area, and through into the northeast, is the Danube Plain. And the whole of the south of the country, including the pink area, the yellow area, and part of this brown area, is the Thracian lowlands, or the Thracian Plain, sometimes called. And it doesn't take much looking at that map to actually see the reality is, this pink area in the southwest is a very different climate to this browny area on the Black Sea. So this map came from the National Vine and Wine Chamber when I was writing my book. So it's still not in law, but this is obviously the sort of direction that the industry is moving. But then there are also discussions about whether it should be, as many as 8 different regions. So, legally 2 PGIs and legally 52 PDOs, which are really not used. A few background statistics. It's really difficult getting up-to-date statistics out of the Bulgarian authorities. I did manage to track down some 2019 statistics, but 2020, no chance for months yet. So total vineyard area, just over 60,000 hectares. When Bulgaria joined, soon after they joined the European Union, back in 2009, there were still over 100,000 hectares registered as vineyards. And there was an ambition to increase the vineyard area to 130,000 hectares. It's gone the other way, because in fact, the vineyard area harvested for wine is around 30,000 hectares. And that's obviously the bit we're interested in. The rest of it is a mixture of table grapes, hybrids that can't be used for wine, and abandoned vineyards. You still often see abandoned vineyards as you drive through the country. So what in effect has happened, I think, is the industry has gone from this volume industry back in the day through the hiccups of privatization, which was a very complex process. I don't want to go into detail now. Plenty more in my book if anybody does want details. And it's ended up with a much smaller, much more niche, but higher quality industry. And it's gone from, the wineries now, You know, I went on a trip in 2003 and most wineries had no idea that we might be interested in seeing the vineyards. The grapes grew in the back of trucks as far as people were concerned. And, you know, it's changed completely. Most wineries with any pretensions to quality, they have their own vineyards or they have their grape supply under long-term contract so that they control the quality of the fruit that's coming into the winery. So it's been a huge switch around. Slightly more red grapes than white grapes planted, but actually the harvest is about half and half. What is not available is actually any real detail of what varieties are grown by hectareage. The last data I have for that is for 2013, and it's based on 60,000 hectares. So that doesn't tell you anything about the real picture of what's being harvested. Commercial wine production actually dropped from 2018 from 1 million hectolitres to 850,000 hectolitres. This number, just to highlight, 5,400 hectolitres of PDO wines. You know, the PDO system in Bulgaria really doesn't work, because what it should do is support quality and enhance reputation. But actually, the rules are so arcane that they're practically impossible to use in practice. And, you know, most wineries enjoy the freedom of doing what they want to do. And I don't think consumers in Bulgaria are particularly bothered about protected designation of origin either. So, and then about half of it is PGI wine. But as I said to you, you know, the whole country is divided up into these two massive PGIs. And say number of registered wineries is, I think it's part of the reason why this is such a dynamic country, because every time I go back, there are new wineries appearing. And that's gone up, you know, 20 new wineries in the last couple of years. How sustainable they all are, we will wait and see, especially with the impact of COVID and so on, but that's for the future. So often get asked about local grape varieties and local grape varieties with quality potential. And what should be the flagship for Bulgaria? So I would say that, you know, there are several potential flagships, and which one should be the flagship really depends on who you're talking to and what region you're in. So Mavrud probably has the lead. You know, it's planted more than the others and on a more widespread basis. It's a very old grape variety, and it seems to be pretty much unique to Bulgaria. Very late ripening, it needs a long vegetative period, so you tend to only find it in the south of the country. Can be a little bit rustic, and traditionally it would have long aging in oak, but with modern, to tame the tannins, but with modern winemaking, I think there are some really good wines coming out with Mavrud, and blends with Mavrud in, which, you know, give a sense of local place. Shiroka Melnishka Loza and Melnik 55 I should put together really, because they basically only grow in the Struma Valley in the southwest of the country. So the broadleaf Melnik, a lot of people have wasted a lot of time trying to make wine out of it. It's incredibly late ripening. So making serious red wines out of it is quite challenging, even in that area, which is the warmest part of the country. I mean, it can make some nice wines. It's kind of quite Nebbiolo-like for me. It's got, you know, firm tannins and high acidity. Some cracking sparkling wines coming out with this grape variety. But back in the day, there were some researchers looking for something that could, you know, maybe improve broadleaf Melnik. There was quite a lot of crossing went on back in the day of the communist era. So Melnik 55 was something that came out. So it ripens two weeks or so earlier than Shiroka Melnik, and it's kind of softer and juicier and just a little bit more, you know, consumer friendly. So again, some cracking wines coming out made from this grape variety, but it only really produces quality in the Struma Valley. And people have tried it in other places and it doesn't work. So it's hard for that to be a flagship for Bulgaria. It can only be a flagship for its region. Rubin is a Nebbiolo Syrah cross that was produced in 1944. And there are quite a few wine producers that prefer Rubin to Mavrud, feel it makes better quality. Other people argue the other way. And then there's a whole raft of small grape varieties, some of which can produce amazingly good wines. Some fantastic bouquet from a couple of producers. Evmolpia looks interesting, Melnik 1300, Rouen, you know. So watch this space really, because lots of producers are exploring. And that's why it's such a dynamic place. You know, they're rescuing the old varieties and they're exploring what they can do with them, not stuck to the, you know, we're a country that makes Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot sort of background, but almost anything you think you might have heard of, you can find somewhere in Bulgaria. Somebody's growing Carmenere or Malbec or Tempranillo or Assertico or Chenin or Vermentino. You know, these things are, you know, it's very dynamic. So among the whites, I think the picture is a little bit more difficult. Dimiat, you know, it's a Hönisch Weiss Cornoa Alba cross, but it kind of makes quite straightforward wines. I don't see it as having huge quality potential. One or two people making it more interesting orange wines, skin contact wines with it. And then there's this whole bunch of grapes called Misket. And they're not Muscat, but they often have a grapey floral quality to them, all of them. But I think it's very confusing, and that they're all Cherven, Sandadsky, Vanetsky, and so on, Kailashki, all called Misket. And I'm not convinced that any of them do more than pleasant, appealing for drinking young. But, you know, I wait to be convinced, because again, if you look at the small varieties, Kerat Suda, you know, has no reputation for quality at all, but one or two really good orange wines have come out recently. Gergana's another local cross. Corco, sorry, is kind of also known as Bersabel. Again, one producer recovering that, used to be more widespread. So there's lots going on. And part of that is because the PDO system doesn't work, and because the PGIs are so large, really winemakers have a huge amount of flexibility. So you're seeing at the moment people working with amphora, people doing petnat. You know, there's a fantastic petnat from Mavrud, which a couple of young winemakers have started making. There's rosés, there's no restriction as to what you might blend together. So there are people working with all sorts of fantastic blends that you wouldn't necessarily think were obvious because they're non-standard, but they can make some really interesting wines. So I love the fact that it's really experimental among the quality producers at the moment.
Caroline, before you move on from grape varieties, Liz Saggies was just asking about what's the share of native varieties against your international ones?
Lack of data, I'm afraid, on that, because there's no data on what's planted where, or any useful data. I mean, the top grape varieties, say last time in from 2013, in that sort of 60,000 hectare thing, I think it was Merlot #1 and Cabernet #2 still. And among the white grape varieties, Misket Chervin is quite significant. But then there's also obviously quite a lot of Chardonnay and Sauvignon. So I can't actually answer that question. I would love to be able to answer that question. Unless Julia's got, or anybody else in Bulgaria has got a secret source that I've not managed to track down yet.
No, Julia said the same. She said, I hope Caroline has some more numbers, as she doesn't know either. So
no.
Tricky to find.
Sorry, guys, but yeah, it's really hard to find out the precise numbers of that question.
Yeah, I know, it's so frustrating, but anyway. But I think we're probably going to see possibly a little bit more emphasis on the native grape varieties. It certainly seems to be the direction that the trade is going, and there's definitely more people working with the native grape varieties, and and so on, but also some quite exciting developments with international ones, you know, things like, you know, I'm a big fan of Chardonnay in Bulgaria for white wines. It makes some cracking good white wines. There's some very good Viogniers. There's some really cracking Vermentinos now. You know, somebody making Vermentino in Quevri, which is, you know, so, and it's working really well. So there's some really interesting dynamic things going on. So yeah, so moving on then to the next scene is, I just wanted to really show people some pictures of really how dramatic some of the scenery is in some of the corners of Bulgaria. So this is the scenery around one of my favorites, Borovica Winery, and sadly one of the co-owners, Oggy, was a great mentor for me in Bulgaria, and he sadly died a couple of years ago. But you know, he and his partner found this old winery, ruined winery in the middle of this this place called the Belgradcic National Park. And even Bulgarians don't go here, even though it's like 2 hours from Sofia. And it is absolutely a stunning place. It is just so beautiful. And they have their little vineyards in the rocks, and so this little rundown winery. So this is Oggy waving at me from the top of the rocks that were built into a castle there. And then this is Adriana with the just behind the crates. And I like this picture because it shows the contrast of old and new. You know, the large quantities being picked into these old rusting bins for, you know, for the volume production, and then Adriana, you know, insisting on getting the grapes picked into crates or into plastic bags. And they have one wine actually called Black Pack, was because one year they couldn't get enough of these clear plastic bags, and they ended up buying a roll of black bags, and the guy in the shop said, you know, why do you want to do that? You can't see what's in the bag. They'll give you anything. And they said, yeah, but these grapes are so good, we'll take the packs anyway. So that was that. But yeah, I think that's a really good contrast between old attitudes and new attitudes to quality. Then this place, this is where we were going to have the circle trip earlier this year that sadly cancelled. And it is just the most dramatic place. This beautiful little red-roofed town of Melnik in the valley, surrounded by these stunning sand pyramids. And, you know, I took this picture, I went for a run in the morning, and this is, you know, the dawn light showing over these sand pyramids. And it was just, and it's just an area with such amazing history. There's beautiful monasteries, so this fantastic scenery, and also this very, very dynamic wine industry. So it comes really hard to people in Eastern Europe to be cooperative because they were forced into being cooperative in the past. So you say to them, you need to work together to present a united front. And they find that really, really complicated. They find that feels too much like the previous era. But in the Melnik region particularly, and it's also happening in South Sakar, I would say, and maybe a little bit for the wineries around Plovdiv, but the Melnik guys have really got it. And it's partly because I think there's a group of about 7 or 8 wineries there who are all family owned. They're all a similar sort of size, between 10 and maybe 30 or 40 hectares. And they've all had some experience outside the wine industry, and they've come back to recover their heritage, and they've understood the need to work together. So here, this is the family that owns Villa Melnik. Melitza worked in the UK for Diageo for a while, and she said, well, you know, I could put that effort into building my own family's brand rather than somebody else's. So she's gone back to Melnik. And but there's several whites. So when we talked about going to Bulgaria, I immediately thought of these guys in the Melnik region because they already work together, and because they understand about bringing people together. They've developed a wine route. There are places to stay, you know, and there's more to do than just seeing vineyards. So you've got fantastic merchant's house, you've got monasteries, you've got scenery, and you've got really interesting wines. So that's their winery looking over the valley. And then this is the Vineyards. This is another winery. This is called Orbalis, who are a certified organic producer. And I love their little half barrel dropped onto the landscape. And then this is, I think the dark red colour is a Mavrud vineyard, and the other two are actually Melnik of various sorts. But it's very hilly, sandy, volcanic around the edges. So it's a lovely region. And I think these will be the first people, if anybody achieves this, to have a new PDO that actually works, because that's one of the things they're working on, along with the guys in the Struma Valley. So again, I'll just show you a little family producer from the Struma Valley, because this also leads me on to another interesting point about Bulgaria, is that actually there are an awful lot of really good women winemakers. So this is Christoph and Tanya that own the winery, or their family does, and Maria, the winemaker. But it's weird in Bulgaria that there are so many really good women winemakers and women owners that are really, really involved in the industry. So, and I haven't really understood why, but I do think it's part of why it's such a dynamic place, that, you know, there are young people that want to be here making wine. Whereas if you go to places in Western Europe, it's, you know, the growers are all old, the wine, you know, even if you look over the border in Romania, there are very, very few women winemakers, and there are very few homegrown winemakers, whereas there are quite a lot in Bulgaria. So as I say, you know, also a very dynamic scene from that point of view. Sometime I'm going to write an article about this because, you know, I don't like to single out women for, you know, women winemakers. So I should say that there are great winemakers in Bulgaria and winery owners that happen to be women. But, you know, it's quite a macho culture, which I've come across quite a few times, come the wrong end of. So, you know, anything we can do to support some of these women, then I think is a good thing. So, and then just, you know, everywhere you go in Bulgaria, this is a winery at a place called Pazagic, just south of Plovdiv. Again, Plovdiv's a fantastic city, probably one of the 10 oldest continuously occupied cities in the world. And so the old town there with its Roman amphitheatre is fantastic. And then you've got these beautiful vineyards with views over to the Rhodope Mountains. Fantastic wildflowers and butterflies and all sorts of things going on in season. And then I thought I'd mention where, you know, places, if you want to explore beyond the Cabernets and Merlots that are widely available, there are one or two specialists, the Old Cellar and Vascovino. The Old Cellar particularly have a very big range of some of these really dynamic producers. The Wine Society's had and got some parcels of interesting wines, like from Villa Melnik. Laithwaite's do a bit, Swig have got Merolio. So there are places that you can buy it. And then obviously, if anybody wants to know any more, my book is available, and I do currently have a discount code that I can't share in public, but if you want to send me a message, then I can give you a discount code for 40% off. So I'll maybe stop the share and then I can have a chat window up if anybody's got any questions or comments or feedback or...
Thank you, Caroline. I've got the chat up, but at the moment there's nothing that's come through. Does anybody have any questions? A flag, and I can unmute you to ask Caroline any question.
Can I chip in? Melnik, when the first photograph really reminded me of Göreme in Turkey, where they're sort of similar shaped hills, but they are volcanic, the middle of old volcanoes. But you said this is sandy, is that, but volcanic around the edges?
Yes, there are volcanic mountains around the edges, but Melnik itself in that area is sandy. Yes, so I've been to Cappadocia and seen those kind of dramatic sort of pyramids in that area, and yeah, I agree it looks similar but different rocks. So yeah, have I spelt that? I'll put my glasses on.
They get erode too quickly if they're sandy.
Well, that's part of why they're that that shape is because of the erosion, you know, over the, so Melnik is, the town of Melnik is right deep down in the river valley that obviously has been eroded over thousands and possibly millions of years. So yes, I mean, you wouldn't want to go quite too close to the edge, I think, just in case. Jancis, the answer to that is Keratsuda, which was only grown on about 10 hectares, but I think a few people have been replanting it. And so one or two, Villa Melnik use it in a blend with Sauvignon, and there's a winery called Libera that's doing a straight Keratsuda orange, which actually I really enjoyed. Yeah, okay. I'm glad you wrote about it. Right, a question about the legacy of collectivism and cooperation. So yeah, it's an interesting one, this switch from basically complete separation of growing grapes to starting to develop wine estates. And I think arguably Bessa Valley, when they first launched in about 2003, was really the first, has an argument for being the first proper wine estate, where they owned the vineyards and they had a winery in the middle of the vineyards. And that didn't happen really until the early 2000s, when wineries could actually start buying vineyards. And it was a huge headache for them, because under collectivism, every single plot of land was handed back to the people that had owned it before 1945, which you can imagine took an awful lot of paperwork, because you had to have all the descendants of that family to swear in front of lawyers that it was okay to hand it on, for instance. And I know Nicola at Villa Melnik, I think, said he had to talk to about 1,000 people to put together his land. I know that Bessa Valley had to do contracts with about 600 people to put together 200 hectares. So, you know, it was a really big headache, and wine estates basically didn't exist until the 2000s. So quite a lot of the quality wine now is being made as estate wine, or it's being made with grapes sourced under long-term contracts. There aren't any cooperatives, and that's something that people find really hard in Eastern Europe. I know a friend of mine in Romania tried to set up a cooperative early on in the new era, and just everybody said, no, it's too much like collectivism. We can't do it. We want to do it our own way. Percentage of wine exported. I had these numbers. I'll have to look that up again. But it has switched from being a massive exporter to actually the domestic market is now slightly bigger than the export market, because the domestic market has developed quite strongly, and it has developed a taste for better quality wines. So the value has increased ahead of the volume in the domestic market, which has helped to support some of these smaller estates, because there's actually a developing market for it. Got some fantastic restaurants that have turned up as well. So again, food and wine culture is developing, certainly in Sofia, maybe less so out in the countryside. And the top export markets are, I think, if I recall correctly, Poland, Germany, and the UK is number 3, certainly in Europe. Okay, availability of Bulgarian wines in the UK. I think we were just over 1.7 million hectolitres were the last import numbers I've seen, and growing, but there's a mixture of, most of the supermarkets would still have some Bulgarian wines, probably on the bottom shelf, but if you want more interesting wines, it's relatively limited. But again, growing, I think there is more interest as people are exploring. You know, I do think that Eastern Europe's the last undiscovered bit of the wine world, because you know, Western Europe's been done, the old world's all, the new world's all been covered. Where is there left to rediscover Eastern Europe? And, you know, fantastic family stories, real authentic history. So Keith's iPhone. Well, I must say, if I ask a question about who owns the winery and they say a businessman, I tend to shut up at that point. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't think it's something I would really want to comment on there. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, I have one. Hello,
Yeah.
Jochen.
Okay, Jochen.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I was a tour leader for wine tours in Bulgaria, and I was twice down there with English groups. It was Wine Trails where I worked for. And at that, it's now 20 years or so. And at that time, I remember two things. The first thing, which was for me interesting, was Melnik. We traveled 3/4 of the country and wineries, and Melnik was really the most impressive. However, I got some wines from the old communist time to taste. They were better than the new wines. And I had never an explanation why that could be, because we got also the best what they produced at the time of our visit. So that is one memory. The other memory is not a memory, it is my experience. I was invited as a speaker to the Divino wine show in Sofia. And they don't have in Bulgaria a national wine competition. They have a wine journal, Divino. They organize not a competition, but a big wine show in Sofia, which is very popular. So that is another question. You say it's such a dynamic country. They should gear their dynamism into a national wine competition as well. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I suppose 20 years ago, of course, it was the early days of wineries owning their own vineyards, and there were all sorts of problems caused by the privatization process of a lack of fruit quality. So people picking early, fighting over availability of fruit. So actually, you know, in the communist era, and when everything was collectivized and controlled centrally, you had very, you know, good control over the ripeness of the fruit when it was going to be picked. So actually the quality of the fruit was good. And then you went through this phase where the quality of the fruit fell through the floor because there was a lack of professionalism, there was fragmentation, people didn't know who owned what. And then in the sort of beyond that, from the 2000s onwards, when people started to own vineyards and could control their viticulture and started to understand, the fruit got better. But I think the early days, there was quite a lot of lack of understanding about modern winemaking, too much oak, too much alcohol, too much desperation to show they were doing something different to the previous era. And I would say the last 3 or 4 years, and it's only really been the last 3 or 4 years, the confidence of the winemakers is improved. They're confident in their fruit quality now, so they can rein back on that heavy over oaking. So the use of oak is better. The alcohol is better. It's better balanced. They're not pursuing 15, 16% in the same way. So I think if you went back and had a look again, if you went to Divino again, sadly, it's just been cancelled this year, you would see something really quite different in terms of the dynamism of what's being done and the drinkability of the wines. You know, some of them are still fairly hefty, but I think it's improved so much in such a short time. And then there was something else you said that wine competitions. Yeah, well, there used to be a wine competition organized by Vinaria, which I judged at once or twice.
Oh, yeah, also.
And politically, it was quite difficult because most of the judges were winemakers. And I mean, that's where I fell foul of, fell out with a couple of winemakers really badly because they somehow managed to find my scores and tasting notes for their wines, and they weren't very impressed with me. But in the case of one of them, his winemaking is so much better now. I really love his wines now, but I didn't back then. But anyway, Julia will know who I'm talking about. You probably have a laugh there, Julia. But yeah, so, you know, as with all these things, the difficulty is what would a wine competition achieve? How would it be judged? Do you have people that are capable of judging it fairly, and so on? How do you judge something, you know, a Vermentino in Quevri or a Fatasca Alba or a, you know, a Dimiat, an orange Dimiat? So I don't know, there is not really a generic promotional body. There is a body called the National Vine and Wine Chamber that is a kind of semi-generic, but it also represents the interests of its members. So there certainly isn't a generic body for promotion specifically. So you have to hence needing to rely on sort of passionate individuals or small groups of wineries that have a vision about doing it themselves, really, more than anything. Okay. Anything else?
Any other
Just something to add, Caroline, if you allow me.
Yeah.
About the export. I think just 10 years before now, the export was 80% bigger than nowadays. And it changed a lot. I mean, recently we are exporting 60% of the wines, and let's say 40 are remaining here on the domestic market. But main country that we still exporting to is Russia, unfortunately. And you know, this is one of our bad connections from the past. Let's put it that way.
Yes. Yes, and they're not a very reliable export partner, the Russians.
No, unfortunately not. But thanks anyway, because you made great overview of what is Bulgarian wine. Now it's better than I could do that, for sure, with a better accent. So thanks a lot. It was really, really, really wonderful to see you online only. And wait all of you in Divino probably next year.
Yes, I mean, I would say if you want to know in person what's happening in the Bulgarian wine scene, the Divino Wine Show, which is normally every November it's on for 3 days in Sofia, is fantastic, because everyone who's anyone in the wine industry, certainly anyone who's producing quality wines is there. And it's a really buzzy event, lots of young faces there as well, which I find really encouraging, young people that want to know about wine, whereas tend to do, you do a wine tasting here in the UK and the audience tends to be quite grey-haired. But yeah, lots of young people interested in wine and interested in drinking what's different to the wines that their parents grew up with. And you can still buy, lots of people are very proud of their homemade wine, and sadly it's not always to modern tastes. Lots of volatile acidity and various other bacterial and microbial faults and things are quite common, but there we go. But yeah, it's always good to have, I think, a domestic market that can be proud of your production. So that really helps. Okay. Yes, that Petnat Mavrid was fantastic, Moshe, wasn't it? So thoroughly recommend that. That's a pair of young winemakers who've set up their own project to really focus on indigenous grape varieties and to go and find, parcels of interesting wine, grapes from old vines and things like that. So thoroughly recommend looking out for that. I mean, I thought that something called Funky Petnat Mavrid, I left it in my fridge for ages, thought it's going to be cloudy red and it's going to be really bizarre. And actually, when I finally got around to opening it, it was just delicious. Yeah. Okay, so well, thank you for your kind comments, everybody. Any more questions from anybody? You can tell I can talk about this topic for a long time.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That's absolutely brilliant. I think we're all seeing very much what we missed by the circle trip not happening, and very much hope it will happen in the future. And a really interesting region that we know so little about. And thank you very much indeed for telling us.
Well, that's all right. But I mean, just think, 30 years ago when I was growing up in the wine trade, everybody knew about Bulgaria and now nobody does. So that's why I'm trying to spread the word. And I'm hoping as well, we did a So with a couple of Bulgarian friends who are based over here, and a friend in Bulgaria as well, we sort of put together this Modern Wines of Bulgaria tasting, which we did 2 of. We did 2018 and 2019, and we're hoping to do another one in 2021, again, to just tell people about the new scene in Bulgaria, that it's moved on from Cabernet in large quantities and Merlot in large quantities. There's lots more to explore that works with, you know, the modern wine trade and people looking for a new story, but an authentic story based on history. So yeah. So yes, plenty more details in my book, obviously, and say do send me a message if anybody wants the discount code. And I think there'll be a discount promotion just before Christmas as well. So I'll send out information then. And yeah, any more questions, you know where I am. I'm quite easy to find.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Yeah, that's great. I'm sure those members that have already put their name on the list for Bulgaria will be pleased that they've done that now after the word will spread and everybody will want to be on it now they've seen those pictures.
Yeah, well, I can thoroughly recommend it. It's a really fascinating region, beautiful, nice wines, interesting grapes, fantastic history and dramatic scenery. What more do you want in a wine region, really?
Absolutely. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you to everybody.